My husband thought he had buried his secret affair forever. On our anniversary, he smiled across the candlelit table, raised his glass, and called me the love of his life. He had no idea I already knew everything. Then, exactly 10 minutes later, the restaurant doors swung open, and his perfect lie collapsed in front of everyone. The crystal in his hand caught the candlelight as he smiled at me with the same practiced warmth that had fooled our friends, our families, and almost fooled me for 13 years. Around us, forks clinked against porcelain. A pianist drifted through an old love song, and strangers laughed over expensive wine. It looked like the perfect anniversary. Only I knew it was a funeral. I watched him toast our future while remembering the photographs hidden in a folder on my phone, the hotel receipts he believed he had deleted, and the voice message from a woman who had apologized to me without ever asking for forgiveness. My heartbeat was strangely calm. The grief had already happened weeks ago, alone in my kitchen at 3 a.m. Tonight, only the truth remained. He mistook my silence for devotion. I let him. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. His wedding ring brushed against my skin, cold enough to make me flinch. "To the love of my life," he said, his voice steady, confident, completely unaware that every word sounded like evidence. I smiled back. Then I looked at the antique clock above the bar. 10 minutes. That was all his lie had left. People often described me as quiet, but they confused quiet with harmless. I had spent most of my life listening more than speaking, noticing details everyone else dismissed, and learning that people reveal themselves when they believe no one is truly watching. When I married Daniel, I thought my calm nature balanced his effortless charm. He was the man who could make an entire room laugh before dinner arrived, while I was the one who remembered birthdays, paid the bills on time, and kept our life running without asking for applause. People admired him. They relied on me. It seemed fair until it wasn't. Over 13 years of marriage, I became invisible in the most dangerous way. Every sacrifice I made quietly became an expectation. Every kindness was treated as something he deserved rather than something I chose to give. When he came home late, there was always a meeting. When he forgot anniversaries with friends or missed family dinners, I was the one smoothing over disappointment, while he accepted everyone's understanding, as if it belonged to him. The cruelest part wasn't the affair. It was his certainty that I would never question him. He believed loyalty meant blindness. He mistook patience for weakness and silence for ignorance. He never realized my silence had always been observation. By the time I uncovered the messages, the hidden bank transfers, and the carefully timed business trips that never existed, I wasn't searching for proof anymore. I was studying the man I had married and realizing I had been the only honest person in our marriage. That realization didn't make me want to scream. It taught me exactly how to wait. The affair hadn't begun with stolen weekends or whispered promises. It had begun much earlier, hidden inside ordinary moments that were easy to excuse if you loved someone enough. Daniel stopped looking up when I entered a room. His eyes stayed on his phone just a second too long, before he locked the screen and smiled as though nothing had happened. It was a tiny pause, barely noticeable, yet it appeared so often that it became part of our marriage's rhythm. At dinner parties, he interrupted my stories with polished corrections that made our friends laugh. "What she means is," he would say, resting a hand lightly on my shoulder, soft enough to look affectionate but firm enough to silence me. I learned to let him finish. Everyone assumed we understood each other perfectly. He forgot the things that mattered only to me. My promotion became a passing congratulations before the conversation returned to his latest project. The novel I spent months writing sat untouched on his nightstand, while he praised strangers online for accomplishments far smaller. His neglect was never dramatic enough to explain to anyone else. Then came the anniversary dinner. He arrived carrying white roses, the flowers he knew I never liked. He had confused them with the bouquet he'd sent someone else months before. When I thanked him anyway, relief flickered across his face. He thought he had escaped another mistake. I noticed the faint perfume on his jacket that wasn't mine. I noticed the fresh scratch on his wedding band, as though another ring had rubbed against it. I noticed how often he glanced toward the restaurant entrance between Rehearsed compliments checking not for me, but for the possibility that his carefully divided worlds might finally collide. He believed I was watching the man. He never imagined I was watching the cracks. The moment that changed me wasn't discovering the affair. By then, I had already seen enough messages and hidden expenses to know the truth. What changed me was watching Daniel look into my eyes and lie with complete ease, as if honesty between us had become optional. 3 weeks before our anniversary, I asked him a simple question over morning coffee. "Are you happy?" He didn't hesitate. He reached across the table, squeezed my hand, and said, "I've never been happier." "Why would you ask that?" His phone vibrated against the countertop before he finished speaking. The screen lit up with a name saved under a client's company. I recognized it immediately because I had already seen the same number attached to late-night messages, hotel reservations, and photographs that no husband should have been sending to another woman. He silenced the call without looking at the screen. Without blinking. Without guilt. That was the moment I understood. I wasn't sharing a life with a man who had made a terrible mistake. I was living beside someone who believed deception was simply another skill. I stopped searching for explanations. Instead, I started preparing. I copied every receipt, every bank transfer, every message, and every reservation into a secure folder. I met quietly with an attorney, organized our financial records, and learned exactly which assets were protected before saying a single word to Daniel. By the time he planned our perfect anniversary dinner, every important decision had already been made. The dinner wasn't my revenge. It was my closing argument. When I glanced at the clock above the restaurant bar, only a few minutes remained before the final piece of the truth walked through those doors. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't wondering what would happen next. I already knew. I resisted every temptation to expose him the moment I discovered the truth. Anger demands speed. Justice rewards patience. I had spent years managing contracts for a consulting firm, where one overlooked clause could cost millions. That work had trained me to separate emotion from evidence. And for the first time in my personal life, I relied on that discipline instead of my heartbreak. I made copies of everything without disturbing the originals. Bank statements were downloaded before they disappeared. Credit card charges were matched to hotel invoices. Calendar entries were compared with airline confirmations and expense reports. Every date supported another, until his carefully constructed excuses began collapsing into a single, undeniable timeline. An experienced family attorney reviewed everything before I confronted anyone. She advised me to remain exactly as I had always been. Calm, predictable, impossible to suspect. Together we documented our assets, protected my financial interests, and prepared every filing that might be needed. If Daniel reacted badly, I would already be protected. If he remained composed, nothing changed except my advantage. There was one person I contacted myself. The woman he had been seeing. She didn't answer my first call, but she returned it the next evening. Her voice trembled when she realized who I was. She believed Daniel had separated months earlier. He had shown her a different story, edited just enough to make himself look trapped instead of dishonest. I didn't argue with her. I simply shared the documents. After a long silence, she whispered, "He lied to both of us." I asked her for only one favor. "Come to the restaurant at 8:10, I said quietly. "You don't need to create a scene. Just walk in. The truth would do the rest." At exactly 8:10, the restaurant doors opened. I didn't turn around immediately. I wanted to see Daniel's face before he saw hers. He was still smiling. The candle between us flickered gently as he lifted his glass for another sip. Unaware that the room he had built around his lies was about to disappear, he was telling me about the years ahead, about vacations we would take, about how lucky he was to have a wife who understood him better than anyone. The irony almost made me laugh. Then the pianist stopped between songs. A quiet movement near the entrance caught his attention. Daniel looked up. The color left his face before he even recognized her. She walked toward our table slowly, holding a small envelope in her hand. No anger, no tears, no dramatic accusation, just a woman carrying the same disappointment I had carried alone. The guests around us didn't know what was happening, but they felt the shift. Conversations softened. Glasses paused halfway to mouths. Everyone could sense that something private had entered a very public room. "Daniel," she said gently, placing the envelope beside his plate. "You forgot to tell her about the apartment." His fingers tightened around his glass. Inside the envelope were copies of the messages he had sent her, promises he had made, and plans he had created while pretending our marriage was untouched. I watched him search my face for the reaction he expected. The anger, the tears, the pleading. He found none. Because the hardest part of losing control is realizing you lost it long before, the moment everyone else noticed. He finally looked at me and whispered my name. I simply placed my wedding ring on the table. Not dramatically, not angrily, just carefully, like setting down something that no longer belonged to me. The silence that followed was louder than any confrontation could have been. The aftermath was quieter than anyone expected. There were no shouting matches in the restaurant, no dramatic accusations, no scene worthy of gossip magazines, just a man sitting across from two women who finally knew the same truth, surrounded by people who had spent years believing his version of reality. Daniel left first. He didn't look like the confident man who had entered the restaurant an hour earlier. His shoulders were lower, his voice smaller, and for the first time, he had no explanation ready. Every excuse he had carefully prepared depended on me staying silent. This time, silence belonged to me. Over the following weeks, the people closest to us slowly learned what had happened. Some were shocked. Others admitted they had noticed changes but never wanted to question what they saw. Friends who once praised Daniel's charm began seeing the difference between someone who was admired and someone who was trustworthy. The hardest conversations were not about the affair. They were about all the moments I had been made to doubt myself. I had spent years wondering if I was too quiet, too patient, too understanding. But walking away taught me something I wish I had known sooner. Being kind does not mean accepting disrespect, and loving someone does not require abandoning yourself. Daniel lost a marriage he assumed would always be waiting for him. He lost the reputation he had built on appearances. But I gained something far more valuable. I stopped measuring my worth by how well I could endure someone else's choices. That is why the truth matters. Not because every betrayal ends with a perfect ending, but because everyone deserves to know when they are fighting for a relationship that only one person is protecting. Months later, I still remember the sound of that restaurant door opening. Not because it destroyed my marriage, because it opened the door to my own life again. I used to believe losing Daniel meant losing everything I had built. 13 years of memories, traditions, and plans disappeared in a single evening. But with time, I realized I hadn't lost my future. I had only lost the version of it that required me to keep shrinking myself. The divorce was not easy. There were difficult conversations, paperwork, and moments when old memories tried to convince me I had made the wrong choice. But every time I questioned myself, I remembered the woman sitting across from Daniel that night, the woman who already knew the truth and still chose dignity over destruction. I moved into a smaller home filled with things I actually loved. I returned to writing. I traveled alone for the first time in years. I stopped checking whether my happiness made someone else comfortable. Daniel tried to apologize more than once. His words sounded different from before, but I had learned that apologies, without change, are just another form of performance. I wished him peace, but I no longer carried responsibility for finding it for him. The greatest revenge was never watching him fall. It was realizing I didn't need to watch at all. For years, I thought my silence was the thing that protected his secret. I was wrong. My silence was the thing that finally protected me.